Today's article is from space, but it's called Starlink satellites are dodging objects in orbit thousands of times every month. Starlink satellites are making thousands of avoidance maneuvers as low Earth orbit becomes more crowded, feeding worries that a catastrophic impact is inevitable. All right, so here's what they said. I'm going to paint a picture of what they're trying to tell us. They're basically trying to tell you that there's a bunch of these Starlink satellites that are in quote-unquote low Earth orbit. So I want you to think what that means, guys. Low Earth orbit means they go up really, really high. Some say like 150 miles. They say these satellites are about 150 miles above Earth. Let's just put it into some kind of focus here. So they basically tell you, like when the guy did that Felix Baumgartner guy, they say when he did the Red Bull jump, that he was up at like 20 miles, 21 miles, give or take. All right. They tell you that these rockets, they say like, oh, when all these Jeff Bezos guys are in their rockets and stuff and they're going up, like when they took Shatner up, they say they're up at like 51 miles, 52 miles, 61 at the most. Okay. Where they're telling you low Earth orbit with these satellites is 150 miles. So you need to go 150 miles where all of a sudden you break gravity and you start to float. So at 150 miles above Earth, in this low Earth orbit, you apparently have all these satellites. But apparently there's a problem with these Starlink satellites, which are special satellites from SpaceX, is that there's so many of them and it's becoming so crowded that they're worried that they're going to fucking impact each other, okay? It's weird. Like, why didn't they think about this before they just started putting a bunch of shit up there? Oh, apparently they did think about it. Let's read on. SpaceX's orbital communication satellites performed maneuvers just over 25,000 times in the 6-month period between December 1st, 2022 and May 21st, 2023. This is what the company told the FCC in a recent filing. So we have this private company, SpaceX, and they're telling us they have to have this federal company, this communications company, Federal Communications Commission. So SpaceX reports to them that, look, even though we got all these Starlink satellites, that there's so many of them in low Earth orbit that they risk smashing into each other, we have a method that we use, that we perform maneuvers with our satellites. So often we had to do it 25,000 times. Let's continue. The company explained that it uses a threshold for maneuvering that is an order of magnitude more stringent than industry standard. SpaceX satellites move when the probability of collision is greater than 1 in 100,000, while NASA and other industry firms use the threshold of 1 in 10,000. So what that means is there's some kind of computer monitoring system that knows that when these satellites that are up there all moving around in orbit, when there's even the slightest risk of 1 in 100,000 that they may collide, that these satellites somehow, based off some algorithm, have a maneuvering process where they're able to move out of the way from each other so they don't fucking collide. Which begs the question, how can something move in space once it's there and it's in orbit, what type of propulsion can it use to move? Because I was always taught that propulsion comes from a force being exerted on particles. But if you're in a vacuum, anyway, that's besides the point. Let's continue. We don't want to ask too many questions. Let's keep going. Nevertheless, this is double the number of avoidance maneuvers that Starlink satellites made in the previous reporting period. The number of collision avoidance moves tracks alongside the growth of the Starlink constellation. So they're basically saying they're making a new constellation of Starlink satellites. For the most recent period, SpaceX reported adding 457 satellites to the orbit. So it's basically telling you guys that Starlink, this Elon Musk SpaceX company is just placing thousands of these little satellites all up in the low Earth orbit. And they're using this to create the satellite grid around the spherical globe. But let me ask you guys a question. When I look at satellites and I look at what goes into blasting them through the thermosphere, getting them out into this low Earth orbit, and the billions and billions of dollars it must cost to get each one up there, I ask a question like this. Why would we go through so much trouble putting satellites in space when, for a fraction of the cost, we can just put that same satellite technology on balloons, send the balloons up, and kind of just let them get really high up in the atmosphere and just kind of do the same thing? Wouldn't that be orders of magnitudes more cost effective, more reasonable, more logical than blasting things into the vastness of space where they're all moving and buzzing around, where they can collide with each other? Why not just send them up real high, above the trade winds and everything? Things just seem to kind of sit there. I don't know. These are the kind of questions I ask. But no, what they're going to tell us is this private company, SpaceX, is blasting thousands of these Starlink satellites up. So much so that they have to worry about them colliding. But don't worry. They spend even billions and billions of more dollars to put an advanced monitoring system in that makes them maneuver out of the way of each other as they're all buzzing around like a beehive in space. Let's continue. Of the 25,000 maneuvers, over 1,300 of these were to avoid debris generated from Russia. Oh, those assholes. From a 2021 anti-satellite weapon demonstration test. Right. Oh, you fucked it up, Russia. You blew something up in space and created even more space debris. While only 9% of the debris from that test is still in orbit, it posed the largest risks for Starlink. Guys, this is what they give us, and people believe it. The absurdity, strange credulity. Of course, SpaceX is not the only company with plans to establish a mega constellation in orbit. Even if some of these projects fail, there will still likely be tens of thousands of more objects in space by the end of the decade. Right, but we're all just going to send people up there, and we're going to be vacationing in space. But don't worry, they got it figured it out. They have it all figured out. They tell you that things are moving at like 17,000 miles an hour in space. Could you imagine the impact of just like one tiny bit of space debris on some kind of like space station? It's absurd.